think the Kash Patel one is settling scores over the Russia collusion allegations and the fact that, in his view, certain people, in the FBI gave that. Because the FBI investigated it, but of course, in the end, came out and said, we don't really think this is provable. And clearly Trump bears a grudge about that and therefore feels that the FBI is a part of the so-called deep state and needs root and branch reform. So Kash Patel is the guy he feels, and as I say, he's on the record as saying some very radical things about what he perceives to be bias in the FBI against Trump.
We're going to talk about Donald Trump and Keir Starmer's phone call in just a moment. First, though, let's talk a little bit about the Middle East, because if you look on the Times website this morning, you'll see some remarkable pictures of thousands of Palestinians returning on foot. They'd been due to return on Saturday, but were held up due to a row over the return of an Israeli hostage. What do we know about that? What happened? What was the delay? What was the fight?
Well, the delay was over the fate of a woman who the Israelis believe is the last living female hostage, not a soldier, who, for some reason, it seems that Hamas momentarily said, we're not sure we can deliver her in time or whatever. The Israelis then said, well, look, the agreement is pretty clear. This opening up of the checkpoints and the things that have been blocking people from going back to the northern part of Gaza, the so-called Netzarim corridor, has to follow, the opening up has to follow the release of all women. So I think there was some back and forth, and lo and behold, I think Hamas then said, yes, we can release her. And what's more, there are 3 other hostages. They're bringing forward, I think, a release of some other hostages. And then the Israelis promptly opened those passageways back to the northern part of the Gaza for the many thousands of Gaza Strip for the many thousands of people who were waiting to return to their homes there. So in that sense, it seems to have been resolved in quite a positive way. And, we've seen the images of people going back now and trying to find their homes.
Yeah. I mean, she's not been released yet.
No.
Yeah,
and no, but it was suggested that she wasn't going to be.
Yeah, and the complication. I mean, I'm not asking you to explain this in detail because the situation is very murky. But the complications there are likely to be things like what she's held by some splinter group that they can't get to play along or something like that.
Possible, yeah, and could be to do with her physical health. There are various things.
What did you think of the way the hostages were released at the weekend, dressed up in military uniforms that weren't their uniforms, that they certainly weren't captured in, to show, to make it into a sort of a military event? That's pretty sort of finely tuned propaganda, isn't it?
It is, and of course, if we go to the Geneva Conventions and all the rest of it, making a spectacle and exhibiting prisoners and all this sort of stuff is not in accordance with international law. Look, I think it's been apparent for some time. I mean, I wrote about this a week ago Sunday, that, the Israeli leader Benjamin Netanyahu will face a big reckoning when this war is finally wound up, about his failures, about whether he deliberately delayed this agreement, all sorts of things. Hamas will also face quite a reckoning. The best information we have suggests that popular support for the organisation has slumped. Obviously, many people blame them for what happened, for triggering the terrible destruction and the killing by the 7th of October atrocities. And one recent poll carried out by phone by an Arab poll organisation in December suggested only 16% of people would vote for Hamas in the Gaza Strip. Now, we've seen all sorts of responses to that. This spectacle, which is designed to present what's happened as a victory, to convince people that these terrible sacrifices were worth it. But we've also seen quite a bit of killing. One Palestinian journalist who I follow has talked about at least 11 people killed. So, some in videos released publicly, Palestinians killed by Hamas, who claims that they were collaborating with the Israelis. But I think what we see is the kind of, the circuses of the releases, but we also see Hamas very clearly disseminating information about killing people whose loyalties they suspect. So it's re-establishing the grip of the organisation as the people emerge from the tunnels who've survived this, and saying to society in Gaza, don't get any ideas, we are still firmly in control.
Gosh. Well, look, as ever, Donald Trump is proving unpredictable because he's talked very recently about cleaning out the Gaza Strip and relocating Palestinians to Egypt and Jordan. It's always very hard to ask the question of, does Donald Trump mean what he says? Because we sort of never really know, up to and including invading Greenland. But, I mean, this would be, if this is US policy, that the Gaza Strip should be effectively ethnically cleansed, that's pretty dramatic.
Yeah, I'm going to sort of lay down the law here, Hugo, for our future conversations, which is Michael McFaul, who was the US ambassador to Moscow under Barack Obama, I think set out a very good rule, which is judge Trump by what he does rather than what he says. Because, as we know, what he says is often trying to talk up what he sees as the terms of a deal. And often we find that sort of liberal outrage, in that sense, just enhances the effect that he wants to have by putting some of these things out there. So I will answer your question. I mean, yes, as you imply, I mean, for a Palestinian people for whom dispossession, the original catastrophe, their word, of 1948, of being driven from their homes, of people leaving their homes, a lot of them ending up in Gaza, for the catastrophe to then be repeated by dispersing these people to Jordan or Egypt, which was what Trump was suggesting in these off-the-cuff remarks, is clearly pretty horrific. Now, I have seen some strands of Palestinian opinion who've said, well, notwithstanding that it appears to repeat another historical catastrophe for the Palestinian people, there are plenty who would go. But I really don't think this is, at the moment, a serious proposition. Jordan and Egypt would both find extreme political difficulties in saying yes to something like, hundreds of thousands of people.
I mean, Jordan already has millions of Palestinians.
Yeah, the majority of the population in Jordan is of Palestinian descent. Egypt, at the very beginning of the Israeli offensive after the 7th of October, there was some, whatever you would want to call it, thinking aloud, spitballing by people on the Israeli hard right, suggesting that they wanted to drive people from Gaza into the Sinai Peninsula, which is Egypt. And very quickly, both the Americans and the Egyptians said, don't even think about it. And the Egyptians moved lots of troops up to the border and suggested that they would abrogate their peace treaty with Israel if Israel attempted to do this. So you can see the extreme sensitivity of this issue. Ethnic cleansing, there's no other term for it. If it had been carried out in that way after the 7th of October attacks. Now, clearly, I think Trump's people would suggest that what he's suggesting is more sort of consensual than that. But super sensitive. I think before we really go too far down that path, let's see if it actually attains any kind of real momentum.
Right. Well, look, sticking with Trump, but moving on, Donald Trump and Keir Starmer had their first phone call since the inauguration last night. Number 10 said Starmer praised Trump's role in the Israel-Hamas peace deal, and the pair also spoke about trade, Labour's new passion for deregulation, and the royal family during their 45-minute call. Mark, I just can't imagine the two of them talking. I mean, theoretically, they speak the same language, but just the idea of the one listening to the other and responding as a normal human being in the manner that we're talking now, like human beings talk.
Yes.
I just can't get my head around it.
No, it's true. I mean, it's a sort of... well, perhaps some late-night radio phone-ins might reach that level of people talking past each other, but Look, we know, you get the readout after these things, which is always, of course, highly curated and edited version of events. And, President Trump apparently commiserated with Keir Starmer about the death of his brother. There were one or two other things about the strong historic relationship, et cetera, et cetera. So, yes, we know there were pleasantries. And there'd been a little bit of commentary about, how soon after the inauguration is Starmer going to get the phone call. I think, look, they had a phone call pretty quickly after Trump won the election back in November. And this, I don't think we can read too much diplomatically into when he came into the sequence. But there's no two ways about it. We know that Trump... and in particular, some of his outriders, Musk, have got it in for Starmer. And we know also that in addition to those sort of differences of political hue and message and vibe, there are other points of substance. which are going to be around things like defence spending and terms of trade. It's not going to be an easy relationship to manage. And I know there's a lot of hubbub in Whitehall, both about how soon Starmer can get through the door to the White House to do an actual visit, and about this question of who the ambassador is going to be, which is still not completely settled, even though Lord Mandelson was put firmly in the frame. So, a difficult relationship.
I mean, on the defence spending aspect of that particularly, look, Trump is saying pretty clearly he expects countries like Britain to spend 2.5% of GDP on defence, and it looks likely that we're not going to be doing that, at least in the imminent
well, no,
future.
he's mooted 5. But this then comes back to the, what does Trump do rather than say question. I mean, the US doesn't spend 5% of its GDP on defence. So, I mean, there's been some, once again, spitballing, to use that word, about, oh, my Lord, how much will it cost the US to get up to that level? People are talking about 1.2 trillion a year on defence and all the rest of it in the US context. So the America doesn't spend 5%. And presumably this kind of talk is what he would see, as the classic art of the deal, Trumpian behaviour, trying to open up a conversation with European allies to get them to spend substantially more. And we know from first-term Trump that they considered that quite a success, nudging various reluctant European states.
Most of the rest
over
of NATO
2%.
has vastly increased their spending.
Significantly,
that time.
yeah, absolutely. There are very difficult questions for the UK, I think, vis-à-vis Trump. But I would also say that there are very difficult questions for the UK vis-à-vis the armed forces. And that significant part of society that thinks this is a very dangerous moment, and what are we doing about it? So I think it is a pretty politically tricky territory for the government, this. If they really say, as reported in the Times this morning, that we might be looking at 2032 before making a relatively modest, so it's 0.2% of the economy, our output, this GDP measure, we're at 2.3 now. And the suggestion is, of the reporting this morning, that it could take till 2032 to reach 2.5. Now, yes, if you're the Treasury, you can see the additional billions that going to 2.5 more quickly would demand of the public finances. But really, in the state that the world is in and the kind of issues that the armed forces are facing in terms of their very low readiness, the ability to only put up a handful of aircraft or have a couple of, submarines at sea at any one time, a small number of surface warships. British defence really is on its uppers. And I think there'll be a lot of people who regarded the Labour Party manifesto commitment to go to 2.5 as something that was meant to happen during at least this Parliament, i.e. by 2030. So if you start saying it's not going to happen by then, I think it's quite tricky, obviously in terms of the relationship with the US, but also in terms of, the government's relationship with people in the forces.
Simply getting the job done, simply being able to keep the
people
forces
feeling
functioning,
they've got a credible set of tools and people to do the job they're being asked to do.
Look, finally, let's turn to the US directly, because we're going to get some notable confirmation hearings in the US this week. Who are we going to be hearing from? Because Pete Hegseth went through last week. He's there.
Well, in a way, the Hegseth, so he's the new Defence Secretary, and as you say, he was confirmed last week. And a lot of people are now saying, some of the Republicans who were grumbling privately, senators, about confirming Hegseth because of his, well-publicised issues with alcohol and infidelity, all sorts of other things which they feel fall short of the standards. And lo and behold, he's confirmed. So is it the dog that didn't bark? The Republican dissident element in the Senate. Now, the two coming up are the Director of National Intelligence, for whom Tulsi Gabbard, who, as a congresswoman, took a very odd, very pro-Syrian line, and in many ways echoed Russian talking points on many other international issues, but principally Syria. and a guy called Kash Patel, who's been nominated by the Trump administration to go and head the FBI, who has talked in very radical terms about deep state stuff and, the FBI being a tool of the deep state and need for a complete root and branch clear out of the FBI. A lot of people worried that that'll become like a loyalty test, for the FBI, which they really don't want. It has to be seen to be politically neutral. So these two are both coming up on Thursday, and if the sort of GOP dissident dog is ever going to bark, I think it would be on one or both of these two, because there's certainly, talking to people who are in the CIA, a lot of concern about these two coming in and altering the sort of political complexion or the political context in which people serve secretly in the CIA and FBI and the other agencies.
Should we see the fact that they're even nominated as a sign of, well, what is it a sign of? Is it a sign that Donald Trump agrees with them, or is it a sign that Donald Trump wants to go to war with the establishment and so puts in people who don't like the establishment? Or, how do you read that?
I think the Kash Patel one is settling scores over the Russia collusion allegations and the fact that, in his view, certain people in the FBI gave that, because the FBI investigated it, but of course in the end came out and said, we don't really think this is provable. And clearly Trump bears a grudge about that and therefore feels that the FBI is a part of the so-called deep state and needs root and branch reform. So Kash Patel is the guy he feels, and as I say, he's on the record as saying some very radical things about what he perceives to be bias in the FBI against Trump. Tulsi Gabbard is a bit more complex. I guess that's kind of red meat for the MAGA base. She was seen as somebody who broke ranks on various things that was seen to be received wisdoms to do with foreign policy. So she was an outlier on various things. I'm not sure Trump would weep too much if her confirmation was rejected. But equally, it's a message.
Yeah, absolutely. Look, thank you very much indeed, Mark Urban. Always great to speak to you. You can, of course, read Mark in the paper most Sundays, and you can hear him on the show this time every single Monday. Always great to have you, Mark.